All right, everyone, so let's get started here. So here's what we're going to go over today. We're going to do a quick recap of the winter, what we saw over the winter, and patterns shaped up over the winter, and then jump right into looking at our demand outlook for this coming spring. Then we'll head into a little bit of an outlook on supply, go over some of our major transmission and congestion topics, and then Adam is going to present a little bit on market-to-market congestion, which you may have noticed went live on Sunday. We've already started to see some of the impacts of that, so Adam will go into that to wrap up our presentation today. So looking at the pricing from the winter, basically, as anticipated, we saw pretty solid narrowing of the north-south spread. This winter averaged about $3 compared to the $11 we saw in the fall. The major driver of this is colder temperatures up in the north, as you would anticipate. But something else that we also noted was the energization of the Y plan, and what looked to be a little bit better management of congestion and some of the north to south flow. We'll get into it a little bit later, but the main constraint that was eliminated was that Smoky Hills to Summit constraint. And we also did see a little bit weaker Woodward congestion overall. So in addition to just the temperatures, seeing some of the congestion mitigated, we think, by this Y plan. We still continue to see negative DART spreads. Looking at South Hub, December and February, we continue to see those negative DART spreads. We anticipate that this is still a function of a relatively new market, that as SPP continues to mature, that this will start to go away. But we are still seeing, and we'll note it on the next slide, that there's a number of constraints which still appear to be under-modeled in the day ahead and show considerable strength in the real time. This also just may be something that they can't alleviate with the current gen stack that's available. But the Osage constraint is the main one that we're looking at here. And we'll get into that a little bit more on the next slide. The last thing that was just an interesting note is if you look at January, the day-ahead real-time spread for North Hub was exactly flat, nearly to the penny. Looking at kind of the way this shaped up, it looked like Ireton congestion was pretty accurately captured in both the day-ahead and real-time. We did, however, have a strong positive DART spread on the Alliance to Snake Creek congestion. We had some outages and just some strong demand in western Nebraska, which helped drive this congestion stronger in the real-time, or stronger in the day-ahead, but helped offset, some of the congestion at Osage, and ended up with a pretty flat day-ahead real-time spread for North Hub for that month. So looking at the top constraints from the winter, the two top constraints of Osage to Canyon East and Woodward to FPL continue to be the number 1 and number 2 constraints. They were also the number 1 and number 2 constraints for the fall. The magnitude of these constraints did come down a bit, particularly the Woodward. And then we noted here that, as we mentioned, the Smoky Hills congestion hasn't bound in the real time since December 15th, which was shortly before the Y plan was energized in southern Kansas and Oklahoma there. We have seen a little bit more congestion in the area of this new transmission at Buckner to Spearville. This started to come in after the energization. And this became more prevalent towards the end of the winter, and ended up being the 19th most common real-time constraint that we saw. Some of the other interesting notes and takeaways from looking at the congestion, as you can see, the Osage and the Woodward have much stronger shadow prices real-time. Pretty much every single constraint in the top 10 here has stronger real-time congestion versus the day ahead. Most notably, we have two constraints, Volunteer to Phipps Bend and sub 1226 to Tecuma, which only bound in the real time, did not show up for any intervals in the day-ahead market. We mentioned that these were noteworthy. because they're external constraints. Volunteer FIP spend is definitely an external constraint. That's in TVA. The sub 1226 is actually part of SPP, but it's also managed with MISO. And we've already seen with the market-to-market congestion, more congestion in this area, and we anticipate that that's going to be something that we'll continue to see. And lastly, just a couple quick notes on the volunteer FIP spend, as I know that was a big one for the winter. We were able to get some pretty definitive information as far as the drivers. The first one being the line outage at Lydia to Valiant in SPP, and then also a MISO line outage at Lakeover to Ray Braswell. We noted that when this Lakeover to Ray Braswell line came back in service in MISO, we have basically seen the volunteer FIP spend congestion eliminated from SPP. I think there was only 5 or 6 intervals that it bound in the real time once that line came back into service in MISO. So it's definitely a load-driven constraint that we see on stronger load days in PJM and in TVA, but it's not something that we anticipate is going to be a continued risk in the SPP market, with the assumption that the line outages in MISO, like Lakeover Ray Braswell, doesn't come out of service in MISO again while Lydia Valiant is still out. And we didn't see that on the schedule for next month, or for next month here. So now we're going to jump into our demand section of the report, and Josh is going to kind of give you the winter rundown and then what we're seeing for the spring outlook for demand.
All right, so taking a look at a recap of this past winter. We were expecting a mild December, and fortunately that is what verified. December really was several degrees above normal across much of the footprint. We saw the jet stream kind of take a break, retreat off to the north. We had a lot of really mild Pacific air come in, and so starting off the winter we had a mild month in December, and then we really saw these cold temperatures come back in January and February. And that had to do with the ridge rebuilding in the west that drove all that cold air from Canada right down into the footprint, especially eastern portions of the footprint. And more or less that's what we predicted, and it verified quite well. We also were expecting a rather dry winter, and as you can see with your percent normal precipitation, other than a few pockets of above normal precip in the Omaha and Kansas City area, the majority of the footprint was below normal. And some areas of Oklahoma even saw less than 50% of normal precip. So warm start to winter, finished cool, below normal precip, and peak demand arrived on the 8th of January at 36.7 gigs. And that was really kind of the first real outbreak of cold air we had this winter, and it was really the most intense, although we have had a few peaks in February at over 34 gigs. So bouncing back and looking at last spring, we were expecting a more seasonal spring after we did have a very cold winter last year, and we were going a little closer to normal, and that is what verified. Most of the footprint was within 2 degrees of normal. We were also going for a rather dry spring, and we saw a very dry spring. If you look at your departure from normal precip, we had some areas 4 to 8 inches below normal, which across the plains is pretty remarkable, and that's more or less what sent the plains into the drought conditions last spring. We did have some pockets of extreme drought. But overall, last spring was relatively seasonal. We did start a little bit cold in March, and then once we got into April and May, we did see things start to become a little more seasonal. All right, so looking at peaks from last spring, March, we peaked at 34.9 gigs. April down to 28.4, and then May we did see kind of a bounce back up to 35. And the March peak, that was a cold outbreak in the month. We did see a lot of heating load. April, as you can see, much weaker at 28. And then May, as we transitioned to cooling load, got some heat to build into the footprint. You saw that demand pick back up at 35. And it's interesting when you compare monthly peaks with monthly average. March, the peak was 34, almost 35 gigs, yet the average was only 28. Now, as you head into April, you see 28 for a peak, 26 for an average, which kind of tells us that once you get into April, your day-to-day demand variability is a lot smaller. You don't see these huge swings in demand overall day-to-day, and that's what you would expect in kind of a transition month. And then May, we saw the peak at 35 last spring with the average around 29, which again shows a little more variability once we get into May. So looking at the spring forecast, overall we're thinking normal conditions. Wouldn't be surprised to see some below normal areas in March and April. In fact, over the next couple of days, we are looking at a pretty good outbreak of cold air, especially focused in eastern portions of the footprint. But when you average March, April, and May together, we think it's going to come out close to normal. Could have some below normal precip across far eastern portions of the footprint, but we don't expect the precipitation forecast to have much in the way of demand implications. Now, the greatest risk of the forecast we do think is in the warmer direction. We do have a bunch of analog years I've listed here: 59, 1980, 2003, 2005. These were based on the assumption that we do see weak El Nino conditions continuing into the spring, and a few of these years did indicate we could see some heat building in during the month of May. So we could see a few cold shots March and April, and then I wouldn't be surprised if we see some good heat building in as we move into the month of May. And so taking a look at demand, typically heating load is going to weaken during March. Again, as I mentioned before, April's kind of that transition season. And then we see that increase in cooling load progressing the month of May once the jet stream lifts northward and we get a lot more hot and occasionally humid conditions moving up into the footprint. Comparing this March with last, I think we're going to see weaker demand this March. We did see, looking at this graph here of last spring's peaks, we did see a peak around 35 gigs. I don't think we're going to see that this March. However, tomorrow wouldn't be surprising if we do see demand approaching 33 gigs. I don't think we're going to hit that 35, but overall, again, we're thinking a bit of a more tame March. April, I think we're going to be pretty close with last year, and also May, I think we're going to see a similar demand profile to what we saw last May, although, again, we do have that risk that it could be a little bit warmer. And I did want to mention one thing when you look at this graph that kind of correlates with what I said in the last slide. If you notice the individual points on this graph, which are each individual day, you'll see a lot of spread surrounding that orange line. The orange line is kind of the average, and that spread really narrows in April, which again implies it's a much more consistent month demand-wise. And then as you notice that curve heading into May, you see a lot more spread, which means we should see some variability increasing once we get into cooling season. Taking a look at the monthly breakdown, March, we do have normal, although I think we're going to see possibly some slightly below normal once we finish off the month. A lot of that is going to be driven by the next couple of days because we are seeing some pretty Arctic air moving down into the footprint. April looks like we could see some slightly below normal temperatures across southern and eastern areas, even some above normal building into northern SPP, and that's as we start to see that ridge move a little bit east. But overall, April, I think, is going to come pretty close to normal when you average things out. And then May, we are going for a normal month, but again, as I mentioned, it wouldn't surprise me if we do see some above normal conditions possibly getting into Oklahoma and Kansas, as some of our warmer analog years indeed verify. So comparing spring again, temperatures relatively similar to what we saw last spring, a little bit less extreme, especially with respect to March. And we look at our monthly demand peak comparison here. I have average peak last spring and our expectation for this spring broken down March, April, and May. And right now I have 32 gigs for a demand peak for March. It's possible we see that over 33 depending on what happens tomorrow. I do think tomorrow is going to be the coldest day we see for the remainder of the spring. April likely coming back down to 30 gigs. Overall, nothing really exciting during the month of April. And then once we head into May, I think we could touch 35, especially late May. Wouldn't be surprised if we're closer to 36, especially if we see some really hot conditions move in. And this slide basically summarizes what I just said. Supporting that warmer risk I mentioned in May are the drought conditions currently across the plains. When you have really dry soil, it makes it that much easier to really warm the surface up and get really hot conditions. This is contrasted with wetter soils. If you have a lot of moisture in the soil, that absorbs a lot of heat, and it makes it really tough to get hot conditions. So we do see drought conditions. That does favor heat building in May, and that's why we could see that warm risk. On the other hand, if that ridge in the East Pacific doesn't break down as quickly as we think, that could have a colder influence on March and April. We're actually kind of seeing that occurring over the next few days. We have that large ridge in the western U.S., but we do think that's going to eventually break down and bring things more seasonal. Now, taking a look at monthly wind generation, this kind of breaks it down by hour in each month, March, April, and May. Spring season wind generation overall typically pretty strong in the Great Plains. Based off our spring forecast, we do think wind will be a little bit weaker than what we saw last spring, and that's because we did see some more extreme temperatures early in the spring with some of that cold in March. Wind generation will likely be strongest in late April and very early May. And when you look at the monthly breakdown here, you can see that in March you kind of average around 3,500 megs during the middle of the day. That increases to around 4,000 megs or 4 gigs during the month of April, and we see a pretty notable drop in May. That's the most significant drop. So we think we'll see that wind peaking in April, and then a pretty significant drop in wind output once we head into May.
Alrighty, so continuing on the supply overview here. Next couple of things are we're going to talk about how we see the gen stack shaping up over the course of the spring. Spring outage season in effect, and we're already seeing the impacts of this right now. The major thing that we have to watch out for the next month here is the outage at Wolf Creek. This unit did come down on the 28th, came off rather sharply that day, did have a little bit of overnight volatility, and then remains out now. We noted that the last time this unit was out was March of last year, although it was down into May on the 13th. So this time around, we do not anticipate the outage is going to last that long. The current expectation is for around a 30-day outage, and we anticipate seeing this unit back up and running early in April. The major effects of this unit is, for the most part, this unit flows power into Kansas City. You can see on the slide to the right, which is a screenshot of our Power RT interface, that the line going from Wolf Creek to Lacine is the heaviest loaded line leaving the unit, indicating that the vast majority of that power is flowing into that direction and then going north towards Kansas City. You can see also from the screenshot we already have a number of units offline or running at lower levels in Kansas City. First and foremost, that Lacine unit right there is down. There is a scheduled outage there that is anticipated to last into the middle of the spring. And there's one unit offline which does not appear to be on a scheduled outage, but it's just not running at this point. And we don't expect that unit is going to get any stronger. Additionally, we have some outages at Ireton. One of the Ireton units is expected to be offline for another month or so. And then at the moment with this screenshot was taken, Lawrence Energy Center was offline. That unit has recovered a little bit. Dogwood is currently down. And Nearman Creek tripped yesterday but did recover, tripped earlier in the week but did recover today. But overall, it's just a weak supply stack in Kansas City, and we anticipate that it's only going to get weaker as we move through this Wolf Creek outage. And we anticipate that the congestion pattern that we started seeing a little bit with the Swissvale to West Gardner type constraint, moving power from the Jeffrey Energy Center into Kansas City, is likely going to be the most predominant constraint. We wanted to note that yesterday we also started to see a little bit more congestion out of the Fairport Osborne area, moving power from the north down into Kansas City. Our original expectation was that something like Ireton congestion would not be as big of a concern with one of the units off, but this congestion is posting just a little bit further, but still the same impact, power flowing down to the south into Kansas City as a result of these gen outages. So all in all, the KCPL area we expect to see on the high side for much of the month of March and really until this Wolf Creek unit comes back. And particularly strong wind days in northwest Missouri, we'd be on the lookout for more congestion like that Fairport to Osborne. If you are Power RT subscribers, those farms you can see in the top of the image, the Conception, the Bluegrass, and the Lost Creek Wind Farm are all one that we watch pretty heavily when those farms really get going, that's when we see the risk of congestion moving power north to south into Kansas City, as opposed to the west to east constraint from Jeffrey. And just the other thing that I'd highlight is with this unit offline and some of the other generator outages we have, the supply stack is much thinner. We'll get to that in a later slide, but anytime we see deviations now in load forecast and wind, when they miss wind on the when they under forecast or when they over forecast wind or they under forecast demand, we're going to move much quicker up the supply stack with a 1,200 megawatt nuke out of service. Once Wolf Creek comes back in, it does look like there's another scheduled outage at the Fort Calhoun nuke, a much smaller unit here, only 500 megawatts, supplying power mainly to Omaha and Lincoln. This unit is scheduled out on the 11th of April. So we do anticipate that Wolf Creek will be back in service by the time this unit comes out. Really, when we look at this outage, we're not anticipating all that much. There was a long-term outage here, which was caused by some flooding issues and then some regulatory issues coming back online. And the unit was out, I think, for over a year, and returned on December 23rd of 2013. We did note that this unit tripped recently, relatively recently, on December 17th, and was out of service until the 21st. We didn't really see, a significant impact with the unit offline. We saw a little bit of congestion around the Tecma area there, but it went away. It didn't really last much past the first day of the outage, so we're not really expecting to see a whole lot out of this outage, and also anticipating that the other mech units in the area, like Walter Scott and George Neal, are going to continue to run strong, and that Cooper nuke remains healthy during this outage. So just taking a look at the overall fuel mix, looking at what happened historically in SPP last March and how February shaped up. I think the most important thing to note here again is, if you look at the nuclear supply for last March, that was with the Wolf Creek unit offline. So you can see how, with Wolf Creek on right now, nukes are about 9% of the fuel mix in SPP. They dropped to 6% back in last March when that unit was offline. So we expect to see something similar to that this time around. And overall, just noting kind of some of the differences here, in March of last year, the coal stack averaged about 15.2 gigs. In February, it was a little bit stronger at 15.5. So you would anticipate that heading into outage season, this coal number is also going to drop a bit. So my expectation is that really what I mentioned earlier is that the supply stack is going to be very thin on the base load bottom part of it. And if we see any of those stronger load days, as Josh mentioned, tomorrow being a case in point, and potentially Thursday here, Thursday looks like a weaker wind day. We're going to move pretty quickly up the stack with weaker coal and weaker nuclear generation. Wind generation, however, from last March and February was pretty similar, averaging about 3.7 gigs for the entire day period here. And so, now we're going to kind of jump into the congestion section. Jared is going to go through, what we're looking at for kind of what happened last spring, and then what our expectation is for some of the major constraint risks for this spring.
Hello, everyone. On slide 18, you can see the top 10 real-time constraints from last spring. And basically, from last spring to now, there are 3 things that have changed. 1 is that we have additional transmission from the Y plan. 2, there were specific outages last spring which are not on the schedule for this spring. And 3, overall, on the aggregate, we're anticipating weaker demand this spring as opposed to last. So with this said, we can look at the top 10 constraints from last spring and see where they're going to be this year. And first and foremost, the Y plan really eliminates some of these, including Smoky Hills, the Woodring transformer, as well as Gordon Evans Semis. And as we mentioned before, since the Y plant has energized, we have not seen Smoky Hills congest. With regards to outages, last year we saw like very specific outages around the Shamrock transformer, which are not on the schedule for this year. As a result, these constraints we don't anticipate to be much of a risk this coming season. On the high side, there are risks that are going to stay with us from last spring to this spring, and those are really the wind-driven constraints, such as Osage to Canyon East, Neosho to Riverton, and Woodward to FTL Switch. Kind of in the middle of the ground, some moderate risks that remain from last year are Milan tap to Clearwater. We're seeing that now. We're ranking that as a moderate risk going into the spring because there are some specific outages there now that are kind of exacerbating this. Snake Creek to Alliance, we do anticipate as a moderate risk going into the spring. We saw this last spring and also most recently in February. And while temperatures remain cold in northwestern Nebraska, we do see risk to remain around Victory Hill and Snake Creek. And finally, Ireton to Stranger Creek, which we've been speaking about, we're ranking this as a moderate risk as Ireton is on a scheduled outage, and this greatly reduces the congestion risk at Ireton to Stranger Creek. Moving on to our next slide. This is really on a high level looking at the spring congestion. As we mentioned, the biggest thing to look out for is Kansas City. With the Wolf Creek outage during March, in addition, Lacine is out and Ireton is on a scheduled outage. Kansas City is really looking to be short of generation, and we're expecting Jeffrey Energy Center to run strongly to help supply Kansas City with energy, and as a result, we're anticipating congestion really to not be at Ireton to Stranger Creek, but rather more at Swissvale. And so Kansas City is something to look out for going into the spring. In addition, in terms of transmission outages, there are a bunch of outages around Lydia to Valiant, which means that this area will be a continued risk going into the spring. And furthermore, the FECI and the NPPD West area look like good risks due to multiple outages around Spearville. Finally, on the aggregate, this spring is looking to be kind of less, we're anticipating less demand than last spring. However, April seems to be a little bit stronger than last April. And with more transmission outages on the schedule, we see that April could be a good transmission-based risk for congestion. On slide 20, we're looking at outages here that really span longer periods of time that are risks for the entire season. And when we look at the outages scheduled for spring, we can kind of break them down into 3 buckets that really stand out. For example, there are several outages around Post Rock and Spearville that are on the schedule. And these outages are, for example, North Fort Dodge to Spearville, Knoll to Post Rock to South Hayes, Great Bend to Spearville, Axtell to Post Rock. This bucket of outages is really going to help drive congestion at Red Willow to Mingo, South Hayes to Hayes, and Hayes to Vine Street. So this is one group of outages to be aware of. The next group is that we're seeing a bunch of outages on the schedule near Gentleman, Red Willow, Sweetwater. So this is going to drive congestion at Red Willow to Mingo, Sydney and Ogallala transformers, as well as Sweetwater to Grand Island. And finally, as we mentioned in the last slide, there are a bunch of outages around Lydia to Valiant, which will continue to make Fulton to Patmos West and Ringgold to Sales a continued risk for this coming spring. If you look on slide 20, on the right side, we have our top picks of bullish and bearish nodes, and how we chose these. These are nodes that are most sensitive to these congestion risks that we just mentioned. However, these nodes in particular are affected by multiple risks. I'm not going to read them out, but it's kind of an interesting table to see the to see our top picks of bullish and bearish nodes. And very quickly on slide 21, these are other transmission outages that we're watching. Really, the biggest risks are on the previous slide, not on this one. However, we're watching these. The top 3 or 4 could be high severity, but they're all for like short periods of time. And then the bottom list are long outages that are very like low severity, low impact outages. We put this slide together just to show that something to keep an eye on, but again, really the top risks are on the previous slide. And now Adam will clue us in on market-to-market congestion.
Oops. All right, thanks, guys. So market-to-market congestion. This went live on Sunday. There's just a little bit of background here. FERC mandated this to take place. It said they gave them a year after integrated market go live, which I guess that was just a year ago. So, you know, we're 1 year in now. They hit that deadline, hit it exactly 1 year after go live. This was included in a round of enhancements like enhanced combined cycle, paper performance, regulation. But this one I think is the most interesting for at least what we do and how you interact with Genscape, and that it is going to have a pretty interesting impacts on congestion. So this is supplemental to the NERC TLR process. The TLR process, transmission loading relief, was manual and had no mechanism for compensation between the two markets. And frankly, based on our real-time observations, I don't think it was particularly effective for managing either the length or severity of congestion near the seams. And that is, in particular, what this market-to-market congestion is all about. So in terms of that compensation, now that takes place after the fact. This isn't something where the markets, essentially what happens is after the dust settles, after the real-time settlements are done, one of the markets will pay the other depending on a few different things, including who had cheaper or more expensive shadow prices. We'll talk just a little bit more about that. But at least on SPP's side, charges and credits are allocated through the revenue neutrality uplift billing determinant. And don't want to get too bogged down in an example here, but on the next slide, we just talk about the process in brief. So there's a monitoring RTO and a non-monitoring RTO. And in these two little examples here, we have MISO would be the monitoring RTO here. That's determined by where the equipment is physically located. So, on the left there, we see that the NERC process, basically the only tool available was to just cut transmission. And now on the right, what happens is this monitoring RTO will send the NM RTO their data points and a relief request amount. And then what the NM RTO is, they bind the flow on that particular flow gate. These are called reciprocal coordinated flow gates, or RCF. And they bind that flow gate to the requested limit, and then they start sharing data. They'll share things like shadow prices, shift factors, real-time LMPs, offers, etc. And they basically can shop around and find the most economic way to redispatch generation to get that flow reduced to where they need it, or I guess increased. Well, yeah. So this is iterative. And they will continue to do this every 5-minute interval until shadow prices converge. Now that convergence is subject to the operator's discretion, meaning that there is, while this is all automated, there is still kind of a subjective call, at least according to the training materials, as to what convergence means. So on that note, there's a few things that we expect this to do. It should weaken the shadow prices of these M2M constraints, these RCFs. It could shorten the duration of congestion in that it will allow, there's basically more units available for dispatch, in a matter of speaking, that that could help reduce the impact. It will only cause shadow price convergence and only in the real-time market. This doesn't necessarily mean LMPs will converge. That's important to note too. So, you know, the marginal energy cost could be running absolutely wild either in MISO or SPP, and market-to-market congestion isn't going to help that. It can only alleviate transmission constraints. So it will not directly impact day-ahead markets. This is all happening in the real time. And in that same train of thought, it can't prevent congestion from happening. You know, the monitoring RTO, that first print, they bind that constraint as they normally would before activating the market-to-market process. Now, on the SPP contour map, we have a little screenshot there. You can see these little red balls that indicate where these constraints are. They can be active without a shadow price. They're similar to where we see a list of constraints that are active but not binding. That also goes for these market-to-market constraints. So there are a few areas where we think we will see the biggest impact. Kansas City and the Oklahoma-Arkansas border, you know, we've already seen some impacts there. Something that we've seen bind in SPP is this Ringgold transformer. You know, this is a piece of equipment that's physically located in MISO, and there's that little tail of SPP that sticks down into northwest Louisiana. There's a lot of lines, well, that kind of commingle there, and so this area is one where I think the two markets really will see benefit, as they can, you know, congestion there can have a more direct impact on one another and help alleviate congestion in that area. The Fort Smith area is one that we will be watching closely. You know, Arkansas Nuclear 1 is starting to ramp. We picked that up on our monitors. And with that coming back, you know, we expect to see that Fort Smith area become more active. And even in the very short term, you know, tomorrow night it's going to be getting cold in Springfield, Missouri. This area right on that seam is one that will be very interesting to watch, as there are some units on either side of the seam that will definitely be able to impact real-time congestion in you know, the Siloam area, Springfield, Brookline, things like that. Something interesting further to the north, you know, we talked a little bit about Tekamah, Ron, some things like that. I think this is an area where SPP will see more frequent congestion. You know, the MISO side sees quite a bit of congestion in that area, particularly around Council Bluffs and further north to Ron. So you know, SPP has definitely seen congestion in this area, but now with this market-to-market process active and available, I think we will see more congestion overall there. Something I think that I know it's a very small sample, but we've already seen Council Bluffs to 3, 4, 5, 6 hit as a market-to-market constraint, as there are some outages on the MISO side that are driving that there. You might see us mention more MISO outages in our commentary. It's something that our two teams here are definitely going to be spending a lot more time together in terms of congestion calls. And just a side note here, this does not impact the ongoing dispute over flows between MISO North and South. And in that same, if you follow MISO at all, this won't directly impact power balance constraints there, as that's not a true transmission constraint. So moving along here, there's a, you know, this SPP is a great training out there on their LMS. They go through a very detailed example. If you'd like to go through an example or some of the nitty-gritty, just mention it to Steve, Jared, or I, and we can walk you through an example of kind of how this all happens, of how they choose the most economic resources. But at this time, there are 206 flow gates that are RCF eligible. You know, when this went live on the 1st, there were 29 permanent flow gates that were flagged as RCF, and as found in the permanent flow gate file on the SPP Oasis site. Last I checked, the OATI Oasis site did not have this RCF flag added. So if you're interested to see what's included there, go to the SPP Oasis site and grab their permanent flow gate file. I believe it's column E where they have it flagged either ACF or RCF. And again, those RCFs are the one you're after for this. So there's a few that kind of pop right out at us. Some of these we've already seen hit since this went live. I think the more interesting ones here are the ones that are in the far western edge. We have Gentleman to Red Willow and Buckner to Spearville. The contingencies for both of these are that 345 that runs north to south. Gentleman to Red Willow itself, and then Hitchland to Finney further to the south. I think that's kind of interesting that these, we've seen these hit in MISO or Gentleman to Red Willow. We've seen hit in MISO before this. So I think those will be interesting ones to watch. We touched on Fort Smith. The other ones here, Fairport to Osborne, Iata to Stranger Creek, probably come as no surprise as that Kansas City area has been mentioned quite a few times already today. Those are basically my thoughts for market-to-market congestion here. Just wanted to mention, too, our meteorologist team, our demand team, has started tweeting out live weather updates. So if you want to follow at Genscape WX on Twitter, get some energy-related weather news there. So some pretty good stuff there. Just a little plug for Josh and his team there. So, so I guess we'll open it up to questions now. If you have any, type them into the GoToWebinar box there, and we'll take a minute and take a look and be right back with you. All right, we have a question here about severe weather outlook for the spring. I'm going to give this one to Josh. Is there a tornado season, and how concerned do we need to be about that?
Yeah, well, the plains definitely have a tornado season. Typically most active April and May. You'll usually see some of that activity starting up in late March, usually down in Texas, and you'll see Oklahoma and Kansas get a little more active in April and May. And, typically we get later into the spring, we'll start to get a little Gulf of Mexico moisture streaming northward. And occasionally when we have cold air masses dropping out of the north, we do see kind of those classic severe weather outbreaks. Now, to get a really active tornado season, we usually want to have a trough off to the west. We have a ridge right now, more or less. We've had a ridging in the western U.S. For almost the last 2 years on average. And with the ridge to the west, we have northwesterly flow that kind of keeps a lot of that juicy Gulf of Mexico moisture trapped off to the south. So I think we're going to have a bit of a slow start to tornado season in March and April. I do think, though, once we get into May, if we can see a trough develop off to the west, that's going to encourage kind of those more classical air mass collisions across the footprint. And I do think May is going to be pretty active. But a bit of a slow start is expected, and then once we get into May, it could be pretty active season.
All right, yeah, and in terms of impact, since Genscape has been looking at SPP and with the Power IQ service, I believe we've only seen one tornado knockout transmission. So to that end, in our observation, we haven't seen it be a problem, but like anything, it's location, right? If it all depends where that would land in terms of determining impact. So our view there would, unlike something like a hurricane, it would be much shorter term, a day out probably, right, for determining location.
Yeah, that's really kind of more of something that's not really predictable until immediately beforehand. But if there was a location, most likely, at least historically or climatologically, to get outages, That would be the Oklahoma City area. That area historically is very active. There have been numerous tornadoes in the Oklahoma suburbs. So if we did see kind of a widespread outage type event, the highest probability would be the Oklahoma City area.
All right, good stuff. All right, see if we have any other questions coming in here. Hang on with us for just a moment. All right, well, I guess the answer to this is that it's a MISO question. I believe this is related to a market-to-market congestion. You know, MISO South, one of the most common constraints down there since MISO South has been, well, Entergy has joined MISO South as Addis Tiger. To my knowledge, that is not an RCF, and that is primarily at this point outage-driven. That's over by New Orleans, so no impact here.
Okay, and I think similarly we discussed yesterday in the MISO presentation, volunteer FIP spend is also, you know, we don't anticipate that that's going to be impacted at all by this market-to-market congestion. It doesn't look like it appears on the list of coordinated flow gates as it's in TVA as opposed to MISO.
Yep.
All right. I think at this point that looks like it wraps up, you know, the questions. If anybody else has any additional questions after this presentation, all our contact information is down the bottom, and you know, feel free to give us a call or an IM, and we're happy to answer any questions. Otherwise, you know, thanks for spending the afternoon with us to talk about some SPP outlooks here, and hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.